Memphis, Tennessee. August 14th, 1958, 3:43 in the morning. A nurse named Clara Webb is standing in the doorway of room 212 at Methodist Hospital. She has been a nurse for 11 years. She has stood in a lot of doorways, but she will say later, 40 years later, when she finally tells this story, that she has never forgotten what she heard in that room. What Elvis Presley whispered to his mother in the last minutes of her life. She never repeated it. Not for 4 decades, until now. To understand what happened in that hospital room, you have to understand what Gladys Presley was, not what the world knew her as, the mother of Elvis. The woman in the photographs, the round-faced woman from Tupelo, who watched her son become the most famous person on earth. You have to understand what she was to him specifically. What she was to the boy before the legend existed. Elvis Presley grew up poor in a way that leaves marks. Not the romanticized kind of poverty you read about in biographies, but the real kind. The kind where your father goes to prison when you are 3 years old, and your mother works double shifts at a garment factory, and you move 14 times before you finish school, because the rent always comes due, before the money does. The kind where the only thing that stays constant, the only thing that doesn't move or change or disappear, is one person. For Elvis, that person was Gladys. She called him her miracle baby. She had delivered a stillborn son 35 minutes before Elvis arrived, his twin brother, Jesse Garin, who never drew a breath. And Gladys believed, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had nothing left to lose, that Elvis carried enough life for both of them, that God had given him to her for a reason, that he was destined for something she couldn't yet name. Elvis believed her. He believed her the way you believe the first person who ever tells you that you matter. They had a language nobody else spoke. Private names, private rituals, private jokes that made the Memphis Mafia roll their eyes because they were so intimate they felt almost inappropriate to witness. Elvis called her his girl, his best girl, even when he was a grown man and a global superstar. She called him her baby. And the people who were close to them say it wasn't childish or strange. It was the language of two people who had been each other's entire world before the world got very large and complicated. When Elvis was drafted into the Army in March of 1958, the thing he was most afraid of was not the service. It was leaving her. Gladys had been struggling. Her health was declining in ways that everyone around her could see, and nobody wanted to name directly. She was drinking more than she should. She was taking the prescription diet pills that her doctor had given her and that were doing things to her heart that nobody fully understood yet. She was 56 years old, and she looked older. And Elvis, who noticed everything about her, who had been reading her face since he was 3 years old, knew something was wrong in a way that went beyond what the doctors were telling them. He reported to Fort Hood in Texas. He called Graceland every day. In late July, the calls started worrying him. What Elvis heard in his mother's voice on those phone calls made him request emergency leave. The Army said no. He called again. He asked again. And what happened next, what Elvis did to get back to Memphis in time, almost ended his military career before it started. Gladys had been admitted to Methodist Hospital on August 8th with what her doctors described as heart trouble. The official language was careful and vague in the way that official language is when doctors aren't entirely sure what they're dealing with. Elvis's father, Vernon, called Fort Hood and told Elvis his mother was in the hospital. Elvis called his commanding officer and requested emergency compassionate leave. It was denied. The Army had procedures. The procedures required documented evidence of immediate life-threatening danger, and the doctors at Methodist Hospital were not yet prepared to say those words out loud. Elvis called again the next morning. He was denied again. He called a third time on August 9th. He told his commanding officer, "I understand the procedures. I am asking you to look at them again. My mother is dying. The leave was approved. Elvis drove from Fort Hood to Memphis in a single push, nearly 500 miles. Through the night, arriving at Graceland on August 12th in the early morning hours, he went directly to Methodist Hospital. He was not in uniform. He had driven through the night, and he looked it unshaven, exhausted, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for hours and is finally almost somewhere. He walked into room 212 and sat down beside his mother's bed. What he found there shook him in a way that everyone who saw him that day describes with the same word: quiet. Elvis went quiet. Not the professional quiet of a performer, managing his public face. Not the careful quiet of someone choosing what to reveal. The quiet of a person looking at something that cannot be fixed and having no performance available for that specific kind of truth. Gladys was conscious but weak. She recognized him immediately. Her face changed when he walked in, the way faces change when the person they've been waiting for finally arrives. She reached for his hand. He took it. And he didn't let go for the next 2 days. The nurses on the floor of Methodist Hospital remembered those 2 days for the rest of their lives. Not because of who Elvis was, not because of the fame, the records, the screaming crowds, but because of something simpler and more permanent than any of that, because of how he sat. Elvis Presley, the man who could command the attention of 50,000 people, who had mastered the art of filling space with presence, sat beside his mother's bed for hours at a time and made himself small. He leaned forward. He held her hand with both of his. He spoke quietly, too quietly, for anyone in the doorway to hear. And when Gladys slept, he didn't leave. He sat there watching her breathe. Nurse Clara Webb, who was responsible for room 212 during those days, said in an interview given 40 years later that she had never seen anyone sit with someone the way Elvis sat with his mother. She said, "You see a lot of people sitting with sick relatives. It's usually uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with themselves. They check their watch. They go get coffee." He never moved. He just sat there like that was the only place on earth he needed to be, which, she said, it probably was. On the evening of August 13th, Gladys's condition worsened. Her heart was failing in ways that the equipment could now measure precisely, and the measurements were not good. The doctors spoke to Vernon in the hallway. Vernon listened and nodded and went back inside. Elvis stayed. At some point in the late evening, the exact time is not recorded in any document, Elvis leaned very close to his mother and spoke to her. Clara Webb was in the doorway with a chart. She heard his voice, but not the words. She saw Gladys's face. What she saw on Gladys's face in that moment was something she would spend 40 years trying to find the right word for. Not peace exactly. Something more active than peace. Something like recognition. The particular expression of someone who has just been told something they already knew was true, but needed to hear out loud. Gladys died at 3:43 in the morning, on August 14th, 1958. Elvis was holding her hand. What happened in the minutes immediately after Gladys died is documented by 3 people who were in the room or the hallway. What they describe is not dramatic. It is something much quieter and much harder to watch. Elvis did not move for a long time. He stayed seated beside the bed, still holding her hand, not speaking. Vernon stood behind him. Nobody tried to get Elvis to leave. They understood, without being told, that this was not a moment for managing. After a while, one account says 15 minutes. Another says closer to 30. Elvis stood up. He was still holding her hand. Vernon put his hand on Elvis's shoulder and said, quietly, "Son, it's time." Elvis looked at his father. Then he looked back at his mother. Then he gently set her hand down on the bed, exactly as though he was placing something precious on a surface. He adjusted it slightly, He stood there for another moment. Then he walked out of the room. The people who saw him in the hallway of Methodist Hospital that morning describe a man who appeared to have aged in the hours since he had arrived. Not physically, he was 23 years old. He was still the most beautiful-looking man most of them had ever seen. But something in him was different. Something that had been lit from the inside was now operating from somewhere further back, somewhere deeper and harder to reach. He did not cry in the hallway. He would cry later at Graceland, in private, in the specific privacy of the room where Gladys had kept her things, where her presence was still legible in every object. Vernon would later describe finding Elvis there on the morning of the 15th, sitting on the edge of his mother's bed, talking to the room. The funeral was held at Memphis Funeral Home on August 15th. Hundreds of people came. Fans lined the street outside. The coverage was enormous. Gladys Presley was famous by extension, and her death was a public event, in the way that everything connected to Elvis was a public event. But inside the funeral home, inside the private grief that the cameras could see the surface of, but not reach the center of, something was happening to Elvis Presley that would shape everything he did for the rest of his life. He walked to the casket. He looked at his mother, and he said something out loud, clearly, audibly, to the people nearby. Not performing it, just saying it. He said, "She was everything. She was all of it." The musicians who worked with Elvis after 1958, the session players, the producers, the people who stood in studios with him and recorded the songs that would define the second half of his career, many of them say the same thing when they're asked about the difference between the Elvis before and the Elvis after Gladys died. They say the voice changed. Not technically, not in any way that would show up on a meter, or that you could point to in the waveform, but emotionally. There is a quality in Elvis's voice on recordings made after August of 1958 that was not present in the recordings before. A weight, a knowledge. Something that comes from having lost the person who knew you before the world decided what you were. Felton Jarvis, who produced many of Elvis's recordings in the later years, put it this way. Before his mother died, Elvis sang like someone who believed things could work out. After, he sang like someone who knew they could also not work out. Both versions were extraordinary, but the second version was deeper. It had access to something the first version didn't. What Felton was describing, without quite naming it, was grief, real grief. The specific grief of losing the person whose belief in you was the foundation everything else was built on. The grief that doesn't go away and doesn't resolve, it just becomes part of the structure of who you are, becomes part of the walls. Quote, becomes something you sing through rather than something you put down. Elvis never fully recovered from losing Gladys. The people who knew him best say this plainly. Not as criticism, not as a judgment about his resilience or his character, just as a fact about the person he was. He was built around her in a way that couldn't be rebuilt around anything else. The prescription medications that would eventually contribute to his death began in earnest after 1958. The insomnia that they were prescribed for also began after 1958. The weight fluctuations, the increasing withdrawal, the moments of strange sadness in the middle of performances, all of it traces back to one room in Methodist Hospital and one August morning, and one hand set carefully down on a white sheet. He carried it everywhere. He carried it into every recording session, every stage performance, every private moment in the music room at Graceland, where he sometimes played piano alone late at night. And Clara Webb, the nurse, who stood in the doorway of room 212 and heard Elvis whisper to his mother in the last minutes of her life, waited 40 years before she told anyone what she had witnessed. She said, "I didn't feel it was my story to tell. It was his and hers. When she finally did tell it, in a small interview given to a local Memphis paper in the late 90s, the journalist asked her, "What did you see on Gladys's face when Elvis whispered to her?" Clara thought about it for a long moment. Then she said, "She looked like someone who had just been told that everything was going to be all right, by the one person in the world she trusted to tell her the truth." We don't know what Elvis said. We will never know. But we know what it did to his mother's face. And we know what it did to him when the hand he had been holding for 60 years of accumulated love and poverty and music and belief went still in his. We know because we can hear it in every recording he made after that August morning, in the weight in his voice on ballads, in the particular break he allows on certain notes, the places where he could have controlled it and chose not to. In the gospel recordings especially, where the grief and the faith are the same thing, where he is singing to someone specific, singing to a woman who told him he carried enough life for 2 people. She was right. He did. He just never found a way to tell her so in the time that was left. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone whose belief in you was the foundation everything else was built on, please subscribe and share it. Drop a comment below. What was Gladys Presley to Elvis's music? And is there someone in your life whose belief in you made you who you are? The notification bell is right there. Ring it, because the people who make us are always the ones we never find the right words for, until it's too late. And then the words find us in every song, in every quiet room, in everything we make for the rest of our lives.